Okay, are you hearing an echo now? I'm not.
Can you hear an echo?
Nope, sure don't.
This is Jack testing. This is Jack.
Perfect.
Jack who?
Should we get started, Jeff? Or Emily?
I think so. Rather than me going through the entire intro all over again, just everybody remember, please, to put your questions in the Q&A and any of your technical issues through in the chat. If you don't see the Q&A, it's in that ellipses beside the chat bubble in the lower right-hand corner. So with that, Jack Krolikowski is our presenter today. He's the Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer in Georgia, where he coordinates the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency's Hazard Mitigation Department's planning, projects, and grants management work. Additionally, he serves as the co-state lead for the Georgia Silver Jackets, a collaboration between numerous state and local agencies charged with flood risk management. Jack is a graduate of Georgia Tech and lives in Atlanta with his wife. And with that introduction, we'll turn it over to Jack.
All right. Thanks, Emily and Bruce and Jeff. Emily, thanks to you all. Sorry for those struggles. My heart kind of goes out to you, that feeling of panic when stuff's not working out right. So thanks to you guys and to the group. So I'll try to catch us back on time just to be respectful of everybody's lunchtime. Next slide, Jeff, please. So you can see here, these I boiled down our agency's mission statement to just a couple of words there. Essentially, we're talking about the protection of life and property at the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. Specifically, our department, we're in the business of risk reduction. That risk being to both human life and property, tying pretty neatly there to the agency's mission. Next slide, please. So when we talk about reducing or eliminating risk, we obviously need to understand what risk is. So we're gonna walk through this. So when we're talking about risk, we start with a hazard. So this, I think, traditionally is the easiest thing for us to think about. So the hazard, for purposes of today, we'll focus on flood. But for those of you who may kind of have a broad portfolio at the community level or engaging with your clients, that could be any number of hazards, natural hazards, wind, tornado, earthquake, volcano, tsunami. But for purposes of today, we'll sort of stick to examples related to flood for obvious reasons. So when we're talking about the hazard, we're really talking about the depth of that flooding, maybe the speed, the duration, the recurrence interval of that hazard. And it starts to be an issue when we have that exposure piece. And so this is when we're starting to put those people in places and sort of intersecting, literally and figuratively, with our Venn diagram here with that hazard, right? When we have a hazard and it's just water for the sake of being water, even a high water event, in many ways, that's not a bad thing, especially if you're a fish or waterfowl. Maybe that's, in fact, a good thing, sort of from an ecological perspective. But when we have that exposure, that's where we start to have an issue. And when we add our third piece of this Venn diagram, that's the vulnerability. And that's when we identify that a given exposure or hazard, when we have underlying vulnerabilities, that can make things even more risky, if you will. So we can think about that vulnerability both from the built environment. This could be perhaps older infrastructure, older assets for which our asset management sort of operations and maintenance has been less than desirable. And so then we have poor performance despite, whatever hazard or exposure we have. And then, of course, we can think about vulnerabilities for population. Certainly saw that in the pandemic. Those could be things like socioeconomic considerations, English as a second language. There's certainly a multitude of vulnerabilities that can make a given exposure and hazard profile even more risky. Next slide, Jeff, please. So a clear look at the future of floodplain management. So this was one of our titles from a fairly recent Georgia Association of Floodplain Management conference. And so similarly, if we're going to look at the future, let's think about what might make that up. Certainly climate. And we're going to work through a similar Venn diagram here. And I don't mean for this Venn diagram to be a total analogy for that one we just set up on risk, but I think some of the ideas certainly are valuable to consider through that lens. So obviously our future is going to be very dependent on climate, right? How is the hazard itself going to change over time? Easy examples of that, maybe increased precipitation in inland communities, certainly sea level rise and other elements as we sort of move into an era of a changing climate. One click for me, Jeff, please. The next piece, of course, is development, similar to that exposure piece, how and where we develop sort of from a land use authority perspective, land use planning, regulations. Clearly, that's going to change our interaction with our climate. And the third element here that we'll talk about, of course, is demographics. When we downscale this to a local community, are we a community that is aging rapidly? Are we a community that is sort of a receiving community in terms of being very attractive for maybe new folks to be moving into? So those are really going to change our future. And so we'll kind of touch on those throughout the rest of the presentation, but I would encourage you all sort of as maybe a homework assignment, no tests here, but I would encourage you to kind of think about that in terms of saying, hey, if we're looking at investing in assets and infrastructure, how might these factors change in our community moving forward? Next slide, Jeff, please. So this is one of, I think, for folks in our industry, this is probably one of our favorite slides. This is the National Institute of Building Sciences. This link will be live when this slideshow goes out. So probably try to mention this a couple of other times, but in case I forget, these slides will come out in the form of a PDF. All these links that you see in here should be there for your ease of use later on. But when we look at that highlighted piece there on the top right about federal grants, we see a 6-to-1 overall benefit cost ratio across a range of hazards as we see them there. And so particularly for those of you who are in the local government, and we all know that budget season's tough in terms of trying to add a new maybe line item or move some more funds to these projects or even ongoing operations and maintenance. Hopefully, when we start to frame some of this through the lens of return on investment or avoided losses, hopefully that resonates a little bit more with those decision makers, those city managers, county managers, and of course, elected officials as well. Next slide, please. So here we're going to sort of focus in a little bit more on that return on investment. So all these grants that we administer, and of course, we'll talk about the specific grants that our department administers in detail, but they all are required to be proved as cost effective. So we need to demonstrate that. But this is a little bit different when we talk about a return on investment than, for example, my uncle, the baker, right? When he is, maybe looking at a new oven, he's going to say, okay, this new oven costs $1,500. I'm going to be able to increase my production, sell this many more units. And in 6, 12, 18 months, whatever that might be, I'll be able to pay it back, right? So we're not talking about that kind of return on investment. When we're talking about this natural hazard kind of investment in terms of risk reduction, we're really talking about avoided losses or avoided service delivery interruption, right? So it's almost this counterfactual where if not for this investment, if not for this mitigation, how much worse would have things been, right? So then we can clearly tie that back to that hazard exposure vulnerability Venn diagram we showed earlier in terms of saying our mitigation could address any of those three elements or all three. Typically our scope of work will address maybe one or two. I think traditionally or historically, we would have really focused almost exclusively on that hazard piece, right? We have a hazard, sort of a flood problem. Let's build a levee. Let's build a dam. And in certain instances, in sort of contemporary flood risk management, floodplain management, that might be the answer. But I think we spend a great deal more time thinking about the exposure and the vulnerability piece as well. So then how do we demonstrate this cost effectiveness, right? We really need to identify this apples to apples pre and post mitigation difference based on sort of the value we add again, by eliminating service delivery interruption or by avoiding losses. What's really important is grants, as we'll touch on, are from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So there's always going to be this tie to sort of the situations at the community level. You can see these lifelines. This is laid out in the FEMA Community Lifelines framework. And similarly, that link is live for you all to follow up with. But essentially, when you look at those circles down there, if any of those are interrupted for a significant period of time, we're going to have real issues at the community level, right? So maybe the easiest way to think of some of this mitigation would be, how are we going to make our lives easier by having less things to keep us up at night when we're worried about sort of the response side or the recovery side of the emergency management cycle. Next slide, Jeff. So what's in it for me? I think that's one of the first rules we learn when we're talking about public speaking, is we're supposed to tell the audience what's in it for them. And so it took me 6 or 7 or 8 slides to get there, but hopefully you all hung with me. And basically, moral of the story is, I may not be that smart, I may not be that good looking, but our department happens to have a great deal of federal funds right now, and we want to engage with you, local governments in particular. If you're in the private sector, however you support your clients, similarly, we want to get these dollars out the door to reduce risk across the state in accordance with our agency's mission. You can see those 3 grants by name that we administer: Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, certainly talked about that in detail today, Flood Mitigation Assistance, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Next slide, please. So this is our first poll question, so let me turn it to Jeff. So I think those are going to pop up on the right-hand side there. So yeah, based on maybe anything you knew prior to today, were any of these grants the ones that you thought might be a good fit for your community, or maybe a fourth funding source that we included just for the sake of it?
Please remember, you need to answer the poll questions in order to get your continuing education credits if you're a CFM.
All right.
Jeff, you want to close out the poll?
Okay, so I can see those results there. About roughly a third of folks looking at the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, roughly a tenth thinking about flood mitigation assistance, roughly half looking at the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. I think that's probably something that I would have suspected based on the really good sort of marketing and publicity and awareness campaign that FEMA has ran in particular around that program. One other person got on board with the Georgia Lottery, so that's the one that I might have gone with. Sometimes on those rough days, I say, man, maybe that's our only option. So that was kind of the motivation for that question. So thanks everybody for playing along on that poll, and we'll see maybe at the end how maybe some of those perspectives have changed. So next slide, Jeff, please. So yeah, well, let's jump right into our winner, so to speak, in terms of what had been our leader to date in terms of interest. So that's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. You can see a link there to the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. So this program came out of 2018 legislation. You can see some of the guiding principles there. Certainly large projects is a big piece that I think can be a takeaway for the folks on board the call today. A couple of other emphasized elements: future conditions. If we think back to that Venn diagram that we looked at earlier, the second of our two Venn diagrams in terms of demographics, development patterns, and climate, and then nature-based solutions. That last bullet point there, that is the notice of funding opportunity. That is essentially the rules of the game in terms of pursuing that grant funding. Next slide, Jeff. So a couple of things we wanted to cover. So one of those emphasized elements that we talked about were nature-based solutions. And so I think most of the folks on board here on the call are familiar conceptually with nature-based solutions, as opposed to maybe the traditional gray infrastructure that folks refer to. And so these oftentimes are seen as preferred solutions because of the fact that they carry all these co-benefits, if you will. So we can see them across the bottom there in terms of maybe some climate change mitigation, social development, human health, all these other pieces. But one click, Jeff, please. But what's important to remember is that for these grants, despite that being an emphasized element, we really are most quantitatively concerned with making this connection to the disaster risk reduction piece, right? These avoided losses, this service delivery concern that we highlighted earlier when we were talking about the return on investment. Next slide, Jeff, please. So to get back to the connection with the lifeline, so despite our approach, be it gray, be it this sort of nature-based solution, it's important to keep in mind that our cost-benefit analysis, which we need to demonstrate cost effectiveness programmatically speaking, will be tying to sort of these lifelines in terms of those avoided losses and service delivery interruption, or really the lack of interruption. That's not to say that FEMA or Georgia Emergency Management or anybody else is anti co-benefits. By no means. We will certainly address them qualitatively, and we will talk about them conceptually and how they allow us to build a broader, oftentimes, sort of community of practice in terms of bringing all those partners to the table. But it is important to manage the expectation that for the cost-benefit perspective, we're really going to be looking at the disaster risk reduction, for example, with these lifelines. Next slide, please. BRIC and building code. So this is another important part of the program that I wanted to offer a little bit of clarification to, in particular, the local government partners. So a little bit of terminology in the grants world. The state, or in the case of other sort of geographies, tribes and territories are referred to as applicants. So for the case of Georgia, Georgia Emergency Management Agency is the applicant to FEMA for the funds. Local governments and certain qualifying nonprofits, but for purposes of building resilient infrastructure in communities, it would be local governments, are referred to as sub-applicants. And so a group of sub-applicants send all their sub-applications to the state, the applicant, and we send a single application essentially to FEMA. So that application you could think of as sort of the big manila envelope with all the sort of sub-applications therein. So as it pertains to building codes, what's important to keep in mind is that it's the state building code that is one element of the evaluation. And so that's when we talk about the 2018 international codes via sort of the construction code program at the Department of Community Affairs. So that essentially, as an applicant, we're covered because as a state, for all intents and purposes, we have the 2018 international code. So that applies sort of across the board to anyone applying for these funds through GEMA as an applicant. On the other hand, there is this sub-applicant piece, which is the building code effectiveness grading schedule. And so that's an evaluation through the insurance services office. So the same folks who evaluate fire programs, and for familiarity to many of the folks on the line here, the community rating system. They also do the building code effectiveness grading schedule, which is all about the sort of the local government building official or building office. And so it is important for sub-applicants to be aware of where they stand in that grading schedule. Unlike the community rating system, for example, that information is proprietary, the building code effectiveness grading schedule. So GMA can't do our homework on the front end and tell a sub-applicant what their grading schedule is. That's something that they would need to engage sort of within their own local government and make sure to sort of touch base with the building official. And if that sort of does not work, then there would be the option to reach out to those ISO folks, the Insurance Services Office. Next slide, please. BRIC and future conditions. Again, you can see our Venn diagram there, really trying to hit this home. And you can see the narrative here referring to how the sub-application describes how climate adaptation and resilience will sort of relate to future conditions. And you can see that we're a little bit broader than just future climate conditions. I would not interpret that by any means as a dampening of an appreciation for what climate change will mean for community risk. I think I would look at it sort of on the contrary and say, in addition to the risk induced by climate change, there's also further considerations of development patterns in terms of land use, population, demographics. So it's not an either or, very much it is a both and, or all three of these considerations in this case. So all three of them are something that a successful building resilient infrastructure and communities application, or to be exact, sub-application, would address. Next slide, please. Okay. So the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program in fiscal year 20. So as I highlighted, this came out of 2018 legislation. And so the first time this program was offered was in the fiscal year 20 grant cycle. So really good news with that first bullet. Oversubscribed, tons of interest, really something that FEMA and those folks who really push this on the legislative side should be really proud of. Sort of a reality check there on the second bullet, very, very competitive, right? Roughly 22 competitive applications selected out of 500. So sort of very, very competitive application process. I want to spend a little bit of detail here on the third and fourth bullets just to be clear. So you can see the funding that Georgia was selected for, a couple of infrastructure projects, a flood study, and then local hazard mitigation plans. But what's important to recognize is that those were out of the state allocation. So each state had the opportunity to apply for roughly $600,000 worth of set aside projects unique to the state. Almost like an earmark if you were to look at it that way. So that's where all of those projects were awarded. And then in addition to that, there's this nationwide competition, which is essentially what's referenced by that $500 million line in the first bullet point, and then the 500 or so applications, 22 of which were selected. And so just want to be clear there that there was some funding selected for the state. But that was out of the state sort of set aside or allocation, as opposed to the competitive nationwide portion. So there were no competitive awards made to the state of Georgia for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities fiscal year 20 grant. That fourth bullet, we haven't focused as much on flood mitigation assistance in this slideshow, or quite frankly, I would say kind of in the industry, just because there's so much funding available currently for building resilient infrastructure and communities and the hazard mitigation grant program, which we'll touch on. But we were really proud about close to $1 million in competitive flood mitigation assistance awards that were granted essentially on the same application and award notification timeline as the fiscal year 20 building resilient infrastructure and communities awards from fiscal year 20. Next slide, please. So here's the hazard mitigation grant program. This is probably what most folks, certainly the general public, might be most familiar with in terms of these FEMA hazard mitigation dollars. So these are the dollars that are essentially triggered by a presidential declaration. You can see there in the middle, we've had 3 declared declarations in the state since last fall. So those are Tropical Storm Zeta, the Noonan tornadoes, and then most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. That link there, of course, is live. That's specifically to our website, where you can sort of get the most detailed information for how we administer as an applicant the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. One important note there on that Hazard Mitigation Grant Program dollars is that despite the triggering event for that presidential declaration being a pandemic, essentially the administration of the dollars is the same as though it were a traditional natural hazard. So that's been a point of confusion for folks, where they say, hey, you know, we want to do a drainage project. We mustn't be able to do that because it's not public health related. Or people are saying, how are we going to draw this connection to kind of a public health nexus or a pandemic nexus? That's really not the case. If we were to sort of oversubscribe the funds at the state level, and it's important to remember that these Hazard Mitigation Grant Program dollars, these are sort of state level dollars, then there might be some sort of competition therein for which public health projects would be given priority. But I think for a local government attendee today, or even state government, or just someone who supports their clients in the public sector, my takeaway with regards to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the fact that there might be some prioritization amongst public health eventually, I would stick to the scope of work that you have. Whatever service delivery issue you have locally, that should be your priority in terms of developing a pre-application and working with our team. And we'll cover sort of what that looks like from an implementation standpoint. But in that case, I would really stick to what your priority is as a community. And I think that's probably the most prudent next step forward. So next slide, please. Quick slide here on the flood mitigation assistance program. This is probably the biggest point, is that these are focused on almost exclusively to properties insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. And so obviously that's something near and dear to a lot of our hearts here on this call. That third element, I think, is something that's important. So as of late, it's been a little bit of a struggle to get some of the insurance, particularly personally identifiable information, into the hands of local governments. And so that requires some coordination between FEMA Region 4, our office, and the local government, as well as, quite frankly, the Department of Natural Resources floodplain unit, so kind to host us today. And so we have this notice of funding opportunity link here as well. I think what's important is that if you do know that you have some insured properties that you're interested in mitigating, please reach out particularly early so that we can facilitate that information sharing. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, these slides will be made available. And so, don't worry about jotting all this down. This is a very dense slide, needless to say. But the goal of this slide was to really lay everything out there for you guys so that you can make some informed decisions. So before I forget, let me touch on these two sort of notes. So you can see the caret there, if you will. So across all three programs, any local government sub-applicant must participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. If you were to stick to FEMA guidance, there might be some situations where the activity you were proposing, for example, if you're doing something not related to flood and you are not in a special flood hazard area, for example, it is not a FEMA requirement that the community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. What we have adopted as a state, and I think it really is a best practice that I would advocate for across the nation, would be that if you want to pursue FEMA hazard mitigation assistance dollars, so sort of hazard mitigation assistance being the umbrella term for all three of these grants we're talking about today, that you must participate in the program. So definitely want to give a shout out to Department of Natural Resources Floodplain Management Unit for helping our team with those enrollments. When a community comes to us and they may not be in the program, we need to say, hey, here's the folks you need to talk to about enrollment in the program. So definitely want to acknowledge that role. And I'll touch on actually that asterisk point as we get to the bottom of the table. So similar to the best practice of telling the audience what's in it for them, I know I'm not supposed to read slides, but the best I can do is sort of walk through this in that way. So I ask for your sort of your grace in that regard. So when we talk about the availability of these grants, so building resilient infrastructure and communities, flood mitigation assistance, you could think of those conceptually as an annual appropriation. So that's a bucket of money, as you can see in the third line, nationwide competition on an annual basis. So that's what's important to keep in mind about those. Look at that grant deadline, third row from the bottom, the last week of January. So that's the absolute sort of applicant. So GMA to FEMA date is January the 28th. If these two grants are something you're interested in, you will have to have a completed sub-application to us by December the 15th. If we don't already know about your application, we'll be talking till about 1 o'clock today. Let me run to the bathroom, grab some water, give me a call at about 1:05, because if we don't know yet, we really got to get on our horse, so to speak, in terms of pushing towards that December 15th date. Current funding, I think obviously that's an important piece here that we can touch on. There is a great deal of money associated with both building resilient infrastructure and communities. You can see that $1 billion referring to that nationwide competition. About $1 million in that state set aside expectation management. Those dollars are essentially already accounted for due to the fact that we're talking here in the beginning of November. $160 million there for flood mitigation assistance. But what I think is really important to look at there is that hazard mitigation grant program, roughly $90 million between those three disasters that we highlighted. About 80 million of that is from the COVID-19 pandemic. So when we slide down to that competition line and we see that the hazard mitigation grant program is about $90 million across 159 counties. Now, I do want to highlight that all the municipalities therein, assuming they participate in the National Flood Insurance Program and have an adopted and approved hazard mitigation plan at the community level, are eligible, right? And so that number is smaller, right? All of us can look at that arithmetic and say, okay, $90 million seems less than $160 million, certainly is less than $1 billion. But when you sort of look at the number of folks running towards it, it's probably a little bit more manageable in terms of, any given community in Georgia, I think, can really dedicate themselves to thinking about the hazard mitigation grant program. How we sort of perceive our team in adding value is we want you guys to come to us with the service delivery issue, if you will, right? What is this infrastructure project, mitigation project that you wish to pursue? We can help work with you towards an informed decision, right? And so when we look at other elements in the table, that's where some of those informed decisions come across. Of course, the competitive nature of the funding. Of course, the eligible sub-applicants. You can see here that qualifying private nonprofits are only eligible under the hazard mitigation grant program. So if one of them were to step forward, where we've seen that most recently has been in sort of health and rehabilitation centers, old folks homes, if you want to kind of put it that way. And so that's a consideration where when an entity comes forth, there's a little bit of sorting just based on that eligible sub-applicant piece. You can see the cost share here. Want to give a little bit more detail here because some of these numbers might strike folks as a little bit funny. So let's start with the building resilient infrastructure and communities cost share. So these are always federal percentage and non-federal percentage. You can see that 70-30. The reason we included that, and we didn't break this out as a standalone slide, but one of the evaluation criteria, again, there's all this evaluation criteria for the building resilient infrastructure and communities grant because it's nationally competitive, like the building codes and the building code effectiveness grading schedule we talked about, like the nature-based solutions that we talked about. Cost share is actually an evaluation criteria. So when a community is able to provide overmatch, so the traditional match is what you can sort of see there for the hazard mitigation grant program and flood mitigation assistance of 75% federal, 25% non-federal. If the sub-applicant is able to get up to 30% non-federal, they are essentially rewarded for that. And so from an expectation management standpoint and from a need to be very competitive, as you all saw, 22 out of 500 applicants selected last year, we just want folks to come to the table expecting that they're going to need every point they can get. And so some of those points are by providing that overmatch, if you will, at 70% federal, 30% non-federal. Hazard mitigation grant program, so that traditional 75-25 split. A little bit more detail on that. Traditionally, in the post-disaster environment, the state has picked up 10% in those counties that were declared for the presidential declaration. So want to break a misconception here. So when we have a presidentially declared disaster, strictly speaking, the entire state is eligible for the hazard mitigation grant program. All 159 counties and the municipalities therein. From an operational standpoint, what GMA has historically done is two things: that 10% match in the declared counties, and then has prioritized from an application review standpoint those sub-applicants from within the declared counties, right? What's unique about the COVID-19 pandemic, you guys can probably see where I'm going with this, is that all 159 counties are declared. And so if everyone's a priority, essentially no one's a priority. So, or at least that priority element does not exist. And that's when we said, from an eligibility standpoint, we're looking at all the eligible activities that we've always sort of looked at. Though if we were to get in the position of being oversubscribed, then that tie may go to the runner in terms of an obvious public health lifeline or sort of hospital lifeline type element. 75-25 cost share, we also have listed there for the flood mitigation assistance. I'm sure this was on the tips of the tongues of a lot of folks in terms of recognizing that, hey, under flood mitigation assistance, aren't there these severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss advantages? There sure are. But it's always easier for us to start with the sort of the less good scenario. And then when we run that check based on the addresses for those folks that are voluntarily interested in an acquisition, for example, or a home elevation, then we can say, oh, as it turns out, 123 River Street does qualify for a higher federal cost share. So that opportunity certainly still exists. We just want to start with the less good scenario, and then hopefully we can work our way towards some good news. Maximum awards, I think this is kind of interesting. $50 million under Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. There is a sub-applicant that did that last year. One of the sub-applicants from California basically maxed out at $50 million. And so I would consider that a proof of concept that I think more folks are going to try to do that this year. Just trying to sort of follow the leader and see that, wow, it's really possible. $30 million there on the flood mitigation assistance side. That's really for what we would refer to as a community level flood mitigation project or flood risk reduction project. Hazard mitigation grant program, not as prescribed in terms of what the maximum award could be. There's really not a letter of the law. And so essentially the way we'll look at it is to say, okay, how much of those $90 million, for example, still are available? If you're looking to take $89 million of them, for example, that's probably not a manageable way for us to administer the program, right? So similarly, we'd have to look at one of those other two programs if it was qualifying for flood mitigation assistance. It would really be that 30 million limit, 50 million on the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. So I think I'll sort of hammer this message one more time. That's why the best first step is, I think, for a local government to be less concerned about the specific grant program they may have in mind, really come forward and engage with our staff. And we have folks that represent about 30 counties each that are sort of project development specialists. And then we can sort of walk through this decision-making framework. Grant deadlines, we talked about end of January for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities and flood mitigation assistance, but really finished on GMA's desk December the 15th. And then per disaster declaration date there for the hazard mitigation grant program, for purposes of this conversation, probably the most relevant date would be July, August next year would approximately be that deadline for the COVID dollars. But it never hurts to be in a position where you're first come, first serve. So I'll sort of leave that advice to the folks in the room. The last two rows, quite frankly, are my least favorite to have to share, but I always want transparency associated with our team and me personally. And so let's touch on these. So the application review, roughly 6 months to a year for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities and Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. So as we said, end of January deadline, we get an initial notice typically in June, kind of a yellow light or red light, if you will. So when we get that red light, thanks but no thanks, essentially, and then we'll sort of reevaluate our approach on that particular community. When we get that yellow light, it doesn't guarantee that those funds are coming. The terminology is selected for further review, but we can probably feel pretty optimistic that we'll be able to push it through. The middle one there, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, roughly 18 months to 2 years of review time. And part of that just comes to the fact that review does not have as many resources surged to it the way that the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities and Flood Mitigation Assistance programs do. So just want that to be kind of open out there. If you're looking for, say, a generator for next hurricane season, I would strongly encourage you to go in a different direction, or at least see what other options may be out there. And if you don't know what those other options are, similarly, please reach out to our office. You can probably look back on our second slide. Our agency is in the business of protection of life and property. So if the best way to protect life and property is for us to give a referral to another state or federal agency that might be offering a better solution, by all means, we're happy to do that. Last piece there on the administration, you can see reimbursement, reimbursement, reimbursement with an asterisk. I think this is pretty important when we're making this case, particularly with sort of the chief financial officers, if you will, of our communities. So no physical work can occur prior to award or final approval. Again, I broke the rule of not reading a slide, but for the point of emphasis, actual physical work cannot occur prior to award or final approval. So what this means is that during that 18 months to 2 years in review time under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, for example, we are not doing work. That said, it is a reimbursement, but I want that to be clear. So that reimbursement is going to come after the notification of award. We cannot be doing the work while the project is under review, and then hope for that sort of good news on the award, and then we get reimbursed. That would jeopardize the award. Next slide, please. So you can see that this poll question is going to look very similar to the one we offered earlier. Hopefully we don't see a flood of answers going to the Georgia Lottery because of me closing with those last two lines in terms of the reimbursement and the review time. But certainly, much like the earlier version of the poll, no right or wrong answer, just interested to see from a client engagement standpoint what some of y'all's takeaways might be.
And just a reminder, you do need to answer these poll questions for your certified floodplain management continuing education credits.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff, for the polling. I think pretty similar results there. So sounds like I think folks were maybe had some realistic expectations coming into here in terms of their familiarity with the grant. So that's great to hear. Next slide, please. One more, and we can do this nice and quick. This is sort of a self-serving question. So is there something that would be particularly helpful for you all, you think, in terms of a better understanding of maybe this collaboration or opportunities to work together between the Department of Natural Resource Floodplain Unit and our department at GMA.
Want to close the poll out?
All right, so it looks like project formulation and scoping, followed by mitigation planning. So thank y'all for doing that. As I said, maybe a little bit self-serving with this question. We saw the call for proposals for the Georgia Association of Floodplain Management Conference. So thank you for maybe giving our team a head start in figuring out how we can make sure that our supply meets demand. Next slide, please. So next steps, I think I touched on this a couple of times. We want you to engage early and often, so to speak. This pre-application page that link is there to our website. We accept pre-applications on a rolling basis. As I said, we're getting a little, really, quite frankly, tight for that building resilient infrastructure and communities deadline, flood mitigation assistance, looking at December 15th, and they really need to be neat by then. So particularly as we look towards fiscal year 22 for building resilient infrastructure and communities and flood mitigation assistance, if it's a project that's going to take some time to develop, we're happy to start now. Similarly, on the hazard mitigation grant program, happy to start now. Eligible activities, just in case anybody was not familiar, and these are again sort of flood centric. But again, if you happen to have a role at the community level that is broader than that, or you just have friends or other folks in your company who work kind of in a multi-hazard environment, please sort of everything that we've traditionally done, wildfire, wind, certainly eligible as well. But here, acquisitions and elevation, infrastructure retrofits, hazard mitigation planning, haven't talked quite so much about that, but that's a huge part of what we do in terms of sort of the cradle to the grave offering of mitigation, in terms of saying, hey, these are our plans. This is how we come up with our strategy. We identify vulnerabilities, and then how are we going to address them? So I see we're running up against 1 o'clock. In case it's going to cut us off right here at 1, I want to say thank you, but let me double check that with Emily and Jeff to see if we have time, or if this is going to end right at 1.
We'll be able to run over just like a minute or two, but not a whole lot of time.
Perfect. Okay. Well, then I'll just say, please reach out. I'm sorry that we're kind of running out of time here. Appreciate everybody hanging with us on the front end in terms of some of those technical difficulties, and hanging in there with us after a long night, probably celebrating after Game 6. So congratulations to all you Braves fans who may be in attendance. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope that some of my passion for the subject was able to come through the camera here. So we would love to hear from you, love to work with your community to protect life and property. And if we have time for any questions, I'd love to take them. Thank you.
Well, Jack, we didn't have a whole lot of questions in there, and we are kind of running short on time. But I do want everyone to have a chance to ask any questions. So please put them in the Q&A, and along with your email address, so we can follow up with you. Again, thank you so much, Jack, and everybody who and again, apologize for all of the technical difficulties that we started off with. We're offering 1 hour of continuing education credits, so please be sure to put your name and email address in the chat right now so that we can make sure we get those continuing education credits out to you.
Jeff, can you move to the next slide?
We will be distributing this slide deck, just so you can get those links if you and be able to follow up with any of the information available. We do have a next Lunch and Learn on January 5th, so please be sure to mark your calendars and be on the lookout for that invitation. We'd greatly appreciate you signing up for these things. And with that, if you don't have any other questions, thank you very much for attending today. And that'll conclude our Lunch and Learn session.
Let me also ask if you could complete the Survey Monkey that I just put in the chat. That would be also helpful. Take you just 2 minutes to do.